A boy of about 8 stood in the entrance of the bustling diner, clutching a worn teddy bear to his chest. His deep brown eyes, wide with a mix of hope and urgency, darted around the room as if searching for a lifeline. He wore a faded blue jacket that seemed a size too big, sleeves nearly covering his small hands. The chatter and clinking of silverware gradually diminished as the patrons turned their attention to the boy, curiosity and concern etched on their faces. The boy took a hesitant step inside, his shoes scuffing softly against the tiled floor. "Has anyone seen my mother?" he asked, voice trembling and barely louder than a whisper. Though soft, the question seemed to echo through the diner, amplifying the silence that followed. It wasn't just a question. It was a plea. Clara, the owner of the diner, felt her chest tighten. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and hair tied back in a loose bun, always bustling between tables with a warm smile. But tonight, she froze, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. She stepped forward cautiously, her maternal instincts kicking in as she looked at the boy, who couldn't have been more alone. "Who is your mother, sweetheart?" Clara's voice was gentle, a thread of calm in the tense air. The boy's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, there was a glimmer of relief. "Her name is Mia," he said, his small fingers tightening around the teddy bear as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. "She told me to wait in the park across the street. She said she'd be back soon. But it's been so long." A murmur spread through the diner, whispers of concern and speculation weaving through the room. One of the waitresses, a young woman named Jenny, exchanged a worried glance with Clara. Mr. Henry, an elderly man known for his stern and solitary nature, sat in a corner booth, observing the scene with a furrowed brow. His cane rested against the table, and the lines on his face deepened as he leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Boy, come over here," Mr. Henry called, his voice gruff, but with a strange undercurrent of interest. The boy turned, surprised by the sudden command. He looked at Clara for reassurance, and she nodded, giving him a gentle nudge forward. The boy approached Mr. Henry, who seemed to soften as he studied the child's face. Something in those young, searching eyes struck a chord within him, stirring memories he had buried long ago. "What happened before she left you?" Mr. Henry asked, voice steady but probing. The boy blinked, the question pulling him back into his last moments with Mia. "She said she had to meet someone here," he whispered, eyes drifting toward the entrance as if expecting her to appear any second. "She told me to stay in the park where it was safe, but I got scared when it got dark and came here to find her." A ripple of empathy swept through the room. Even the teenagers at the corner booth, who had been laughing moments before, sat in silence, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Clara's heart ached as she stepped closer, wanting to comfort the boy. But before she could move, Mr. Henry spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "Do you remember anything else? Did she say who she was meeting?" The old man's eyes bore into the boy, searching for any clue that might explain why this child stood here, lost and afraid. The boy nodded slowly, as if pulling the memory from a deep well. "She said she was meeting someone named Mr. Clark." The name seemed to slice through the room, and a sudden hush fell over the patrons. Mr. Henry's eyes widened, a flicker of something dark crossing his expression. Recognition. Clara's eyes darted around, scanning the faces of the diners, searching for any sign of reaction. A man sitting near the entrance, with a weathered face and nervous demeanor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The way he avoided eye contact did not escape her notice. Clara's jaw tightened as she turned her focus back to Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry leaned back in his seat, eyes still locked on the boy. "Clark, you say?" His voice was a whisper now, but it carried the weight of something deeper, an old story resurfacing. The boy nodded again, eyes wide with confusion and the dawning realization that something was very wrong. "Yes. Do you know him?" Before Mr. Henry could answer, The man near the entrance stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. The sound snapped everyone's attention to him. His eyes were wide, darting around as if looking for an escape. Clara's pulse quickened. She took a step forward, her voice ringing out with authority she didn't know she possessed. "Sir, is everything all right?" The man's gaze met hers for a fleeting moment before shifting to the boy, then to Mr. Henry. Without a word, he bolted for the door, shoving past tables and chairs in his hurry. The boy gasped, taking a step back as the scene erupted into chaos. Patrons scrambled to move out of the way, a chorus of startled exclamations filling the diner. Mr. Henry stood, the determination in his eyes sharper than ever. "Stop him," he shouted, voice carrying a strength that defied his age. Clara moved instinctively, but it was Jenny who managed to block the man's path for a split second, enough for a nearby patron to grab his arm. The man struggled, cursing under his breath, eyes wild with panic. The boy clutched his teddy bear tighter, tears now streaming down his face as he watched the man's every move. Mr. Henry hobbled closer, leaning on his cane, but not slowing his steps. He stopped just a foot away from the man, eyes narrowed to slits. "What have you done, Clark?" he demanded, voice low but seething with rage. The man, now pinned by the combined strength of two patrons, stopped struggling. His eyes darted around, calculating, desperate. But Mr. Henry's words seemed to deflate him, leaving him silent and shaking. Clara approached, her voice gentle but firm. "We're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to find her," she said, glancing back at the boy who stood trembling, eyes locked on Mr. Henry and the man now known as Clark. And as the sounds of distant sirens pierced the heavy silence, the boy looked at Clara, a flicker of hope battling against the fear in his eyes. The sirens grew louder, their wailing echoing through the quiet night as police cars pulled up outside the diner. The red and blue lights cast flickering shadows across the room, painting anxious faces in flashes of color. Patrons sat frozen, unsure whether to leave or stay. Clara placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder as two officers entered, their presence immediately commanding attention. Mr. Henry stood tall, despite the tremor in his hands. His eyes remained locked on Clark, who now sat in a chair, wrists secured by the firm grip of one of the officers. The man's defiant expression had crumbled, leaving behind a mask of guilt and exhaustion. The boy, eyes still wide and tear-streaked, clung to his teddy bear as if it were the only anchor in a world suddenly upended. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered woman with a no-nonsense air, stepped forward. "We received reports of a disturbance," she said, scanning the room before her gaze settled on Clark. "What's going on here?" Clara took a step forward, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. "This man, Clark, might be involved in the disappearance of this boy's mother, Mia," she said, gesturing toward the boy, who now looked at the officer with a mix of fear and hope. The officer's eyes softened as she crouched down to the boy's level. "Hey there, buddy. We're going to help find your mom, okay?" The boy nodded, his fingers flexing nervously on the worn fur of his bear. Mr. Henry cleared his throat, drawing the officer's attention. "Clark was once my business partner," he said, his voice low and measured. "We had a falling out years ago. Mia was involved in that mess, and it seems the past has come back to haunt us." Clark's eyes darted between Mr. Henry and the officer, sweat beading on his brow. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he muttered, eyes pleading. But the officer silenced him with a sharp look. "You'll have your chance to speak at the station," she said, signaling for the other officer to take Clark outside. The room buzzed with whispers as he was led out, the metallic click of handcuffs a haunting punctuation to his exit. Clara exhaled a breath she didn't know she was holding. She turned back to the boy, who stood silent, processing everything with the wide-eyed solemnity of someone forced to grow up too fast. "We're going to find her," she repeated, this time more for herself than for him. Mr. Henry's gaze fell to the boy, a storm of emotions warring in his expression. Regret, sorrow, and a fierce determination to make things right. "What else did Mia tell you, son?" he asked, voice softer now, almost tender. The boy glanced up, eyes searching Mr. Henry's face. "She said she was meeting Mr. Clark to talk about something important. She said she'd come back soon, but she looked scared," he whispered, the memory making him shiver. Mr. Henry nodded, the boy's words slicing through him like a blade. He had been too blind to the warning signs back then, too wrapped up in his pride and anger. But now, with the boy standing before him and Mia somewhere out there, fear and hope tangled, he knew there was no room for mistakes. The officer who had spoken earlier approached Clara and Mr. Henry. "We need you both to come down to the station to make statements, and we'll need to know everything you remember about Clark and your past dealings with him." Mr. Henry's jaw tightened. "I'll tell you everything," he said, eyes flickering to the boy, who met his gaze with a small nod of trust. For the first time in years, Henry felt the spark of resolve that had once defined him. As they stepped out into the cold night, the boy squeezed Clara's hand, and she smiled down at him, a silent promise in her eyes. They were just at the beginning of this long and uncertain journey, but they weren't alone anymore. The police station was a stark contrast to the warm, dimly lit diner they had just left. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the worn desks and endless stacks of paperwork. The hum of police radios and the occasional murmur of officers created a tense backdrop. Mr. Henry, Clara, and the boy were led into an interview room, its walls lined with old bulletin boards cluttered with notes and photos. The boy sat between Clara and Mr. Henry, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair. He clutched his teddy bear, the fabric now worn thin from the constant grip. Clara reached over and patted his back reassuringly, while Mr. Henry stared at the tabletop, lost in a storm of memories. An officer entered, her expression professional but kind. She placed a recorder on the table and clicked on. "Please state your name," she said, her eyes shifting to Mr. Henry. "Henry Malloy," he responded, his voice gravelly and low. He took a deep breath before continuing. "Clark was my partner in a shipping business years ago. We were successful, but greed and betrayal tore us apart. Mia, my daughter, found herself caught in the middle of our conflict." Clara's brows furrowed as she listened, her mind piecing together the fragments of Henry's past. She'd known him as the grumpy old man at table 5, but now she saw the shadows that haunted him. The officer nodded, scribbling notes as Henry spoke. "Mia tried to mediate between us," he continued, eyes glazing over as he remembered. "She always wanted peace, but when Clark threatened to expose our financial disagreements and involve her, she stepped away. I let my pride push her out, and we lost touch." The boy, listening intently, shifted in his seat. "But why would Mr. Clark come back now?" he asked, voice small but determined. Henry sighed, the weight of his past pressing down on him. "I don't know, but I'd bet everything that Mia came here tonight to settle old debts." And something went wrong. The officer exchanged a glance with Clara. "We're already questioning Clark, and we'll look into any connections he might still have. But time is of the essence," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Clara leaned forward, eyes pleading. "Please, we need to find her. There must be something we can do to help." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "We have officers checking the pier and other places Clark was known to frequent. If either of you remembers anything else, no matter how small, let us know immediately." The boy's eyes lit up suddenly, as if a light bulb had flicked on in his mind. "The pier. Mom always said it was her favorite place to think. She told me stories about it when she was a little girl," he blurted out, hope gleaming in his eyes. Henry sat up straighter, the boy's words reigniting the fire within him. "Then that's where we need to go," he said, looking at Clara and the officer. Determination etched itself across his face, years of regret giving way to action. The officer glanced at her partner, who nodded. "We'll send units to the pier right now. You can come, but stay close to us. It's still potentially dangerous." As they prepared to leave, Henry reached for the boy's hand, feeling the small, warm fingers intertwine with his own. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. They were in this together now, bound by blood and an unspoken promise to find Mia, no matter what it took. The drive to the pier was filled with tense silence. The city lights blurred past as they raced down the nearly empty streets. The boy sat in the back seat between Clara and Mr. Henry, his eyes wide and fixed on the road ahead. Mr. Henry's hand rested protectively on the boy's small shoulder, squeezing gently whenever the silence grew too heavy. The pier loomed ahead, dark and silent under the soft glow of street lamps. The gentle lapping of the waves against the wooden posts filled the air, carrying with it a chill that seeped into their bones. Officers had already cordoned off sections, their flashlights slicing through the night as they combed the area. Clara stepped out of the car, shivering as the sea breeze wrapped around her. She glanced at Mr. Henry, who seemed to grow 10 years older under the harsh lights. But his eyes were sharp, scanning every shadow as if Mia might appear at any moment. The boy clutched his teddy bear, staring at the pier with a mixture of hope and fear. An officer approached them, nodding in acknowledgement. "We're searching, but so far, no sign of her," he said. His tone was professional, but Clara could hear the faint thread of worry behind it. Mr. Henry's face hardened with determination. "I'm going to look myself," he declared, stepping toward the pier despite the officer's warnings. The boy's eyes followed him, feet moving instinctively to keep up. "Wait," Clara said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay close to me, okay?" He nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on Henry, who now moved with surprising agility across the wooden boards, each step echoing softly in the dark. The pier stretched out into the water, its edges disappearing into the mist. Henry's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, memories of better days flashing before him, days when Mia would laugh and run down this very pier, her hair catching the sunlight. The ache in his heart grew sharper with each step. A sudden sound, a soft thud, caught his attention. He turned, breath catching in his throat. Farther down the pier, half hidden in shadow, was a figure slumped against the railing. "Mia." The word escaped his lips, barely audible. He took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see her face. It was pale, framed by dark hair that spilled over her shoulders, and her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Clara gasped as she reached them, tears springing to her eyes. "She's alive," she whispered, the words tumbling out with a sob of relief. The boy rushed forward, dropping his teddy bear as he threw himself into his mother's arms. Mia stirred, eyelids fluttering open as if waking from a dream. Her gaze focused on her son, then on Henry, and a weak smile curved her lips. "Dad," she whispered, voice cracked but unmistakably full of recognition and gratitude. Henry fell to his knees beside her, tears streaming down his lined face. "I'm here, Mia. I'm so sorry," he said, voice breaking. The weight of years of regret lifted slightly as she reached out and touched his hand. Clara knelt beside them, placing a comforting arm around the boy. The police officers approached cautiously, radios crackling with updates. But in that moment, under the cool night sky and surrounded by the rhythmic crashing of waves, all that mattered was that they had found her. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their presence filling the pier with an air of urgency. They gently lifted Mia onto a stretcher, checking her vitals and murmuring quietly to each other. Mr. Henry stayed close, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face, as if afraid she might disappear if he looked away. Mia's fingers brushed against her son's hand, a silent promise that she was still there, still holding on. The boy's eyes shimmered with tears, but he managed a small smile, clinging to his mother's touch. Clara stood beside them, her heart swelling with relief and hope. The officers watched the scene, exchanging glances as questions filled the space between them. One of the officers approached Mr. Henry, notepad in hand. "Sir, can you tell us more about what happened between you and Clark? We need to understand why Mia was here tonight." Henry's face hardened, the lines on his face deepening as he took a breath. "Clark and I were partners years ago," he began, voice steady but tinged with old bitterness. "We ran a successful shipping business until he started skimming profits and making deals behind my back. Mia found out and tried to confront him. She warned me, but I didn't listen. My pride kept me from seeing the danger she was in." Clara's eyes widened as the pieces started to fall into place. The whispers of betrayal, the hints of desperation in Henry's voice, everything pointed to a story that had been left unfinished until now. Mia's eyes fluttered open, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Clark wanted leverage," she said, wincing as the paramedics adjusted her position. "He knew I was trying to stop him, and he threatened to use me to get to you, Dad." The boy squeezed her hand tighter, eyes darting between his mother and grandfather. Henry's jaw clenched, regret twisting in his chest. "I should have protected you," he said, voice breaking. "I failed you." Mia's eyes met his, tired but resolute. "But you came for me," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You found me." An officer stepped forward, his expression softening at the sight of the family reunited. "Clark is in custody and being questioned," he said. "We'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone again. But we'll need you to come to the station and give full statements once Mia is stable." Clara nodded, her arms still around the boy. "We'll be there," she promised, glancing at Henry, who met her gaze with a silent nod of gratitude. The weight of years seemed to ease from his shoulders, if only for a moment. The paramedics began to move Mia toward the waiting ambulance. The boy kept pace beside her, refusing to let go of her hand. Henry and Clara followed, the cold sea breeze at their backs as they left the pier, a place once filled with echoes of the past, now carrying whispers of a new chapter waiting to be written. The quiet hum of the ambulance filled the air as it moved through the city streets, lights casting fleeting patterns on the windows. The boy sat beside Mia, his small hand still clasped tightly in hers, refusing to let go. Mr. Henry and Clara followed closely in a separate car, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The silence between them was heavy, but it carried a shared understanding. There were still pieces to uncover, and the truth had only just begun to reveal itself. At the hospital, Mia was whisked away for evaluation, leaving the boy to wait with Clara and Mr. Henry in the sterile, bright waiting room. The boy's eyes never strayed from the doors where his mother had disappeared, fear still flickering in their depths despite the comfort of Clara's arm around him. Mr. Henry paced the room, his cane tapping rhythmically on the tiled floor. The memories of his own failings gnawed at him, mixing with a surge of protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. He stopped when the officer who had questioned them earlier entered the room, her expression serious. "Clark has started talking," she said, looking between them. "He claims he only intended to scare Mia, not hurt her, but things got out of hand when she threatened to expose more of what he'd done over the years." Mr. Henry's jaw tightened, and his eyes flashed with a fury that surprised even him. "Scaring her was enough to put her life at risk," he said, voice low but charged. Clara reached out and placed a calming hand on his arm. The officer nodded, acknowledging the emotion in the room. "There's more," she said, leaning in slightly. Mia had documents proving Clark's involvement in laundering money through the shipping business long after you cut ties. That's why he was desperate enough to confront her tonight. We found the papers in her bag at the pier. Clara's eyes widened as the implications set in. So she knew. All this time, the room fell silent as they each processed the weight of that revelation. Before anyone could respond, the doors to the examination room swung open, and a doctor stepped out. He approached with a reassuring smile. "She's stable and asking for her family." The boy leapt to his feet, the weariness in his eyes momentarily replaced with hope. Henry and Clara followed, moving as one into the small hospital room where Mia lay, propped up on pillows with bandages and 4 lines. Mia's eyes lit up when she saw her son, who rushed to her side. "Hey, my brave boy," she whispered, brushing his hair back. She looked up at her father, eyes softening. "Dad." Henry's throat tightened, words failing him as he took her hand. "Mia, I'm so sorry for everything," he managed, the rawness in his voice speaking volumes. Mia's eyes welled with tears, but there was no anger, only relief and understanding. "It's over now, Dad. We're together, and that's all that matters." The boy nestled against her, Clara standing nearby with a smile that mirrored the first light of dawn. And though the night had brought shadows and memories long buried, they stood now on the edge of a new day, bound by a bond that no betrayal or time could break. Morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, casting soft rays across the sterile room. The first hints of dawn carried with it the whispers of new beginnings, but the weight of the night before still hung heavily over them all. Mia rested with her son nestled beside her, his head tucked into her arm as if afraid to let go. Clara sat at the edge of the room, her presence a quiet comfort, while Mr. Henry stood by the window, lost in thought. The officer from the night before knocked lightly and entered, nodding at Mr. Henry. "Clark has provided enough information for us to close the investigation," she said, breaking the silence. "He's facing charges that will keep him away for a long time." Her eyes softened as she glanced at Mia. "You don't need to be afraid anymore." Mia nodded slowly, eyes drifting to her son, who stirred and blinked up at her with a sleepy smile. The room seemed to exhale, a collective release of tension that had gripped them all through the night. But forgiveness was a different matter, and it sat heavily in the air. Mr. Henry turned, stepping closer to Mia. His weathered face was etched with lines of regret and relief, a combination that tugged at her heart. "I can't change what happened," he said, voice trembling. "I let you face so much alone, and for that, I'll always be sorry." Mia reached out, her hand warm against his as she squeezed it gently. "I was angry, Dad, for a long time, but I understand now. You were fighting your own battles." Her eyes softened, the corners of her lips lifting in a small smile. "And you're here now. That's what matters." Clara watched, eyes misting as the unspoken words filled the room. The boy's gaze moved between his mother and grandfather, sensing the shift, even if he didn't fully grasp it. His small hand reached out to grasp Henry's, a gesture that pulled them all together. "Does this mean we can go back home?" he asked, hope sparking in his voice. Mia nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, my love, we can go home." Mr. Henry's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he looked at the boy and then at Mia. The decades of distance, the walls built from pride and pain, seemed to crumble in that moment. Clara's heart swelled with warmth as she stood, placing a supportive hand on Henry's shoulder. The officer cleared her throat gently. "We'll need to finalize a few things, but you're all free to go soon." She paused, a rare smile breaking through her professional mask. "It's good to see a story end like this." Mia's eyes met Henry's once more, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. There were still scars to heal, wounds that time would have to tend to. But in the soft morning light, surrounded by her son, her father, and friends who had become family, Mia felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. The past had been dark, full of regret and shadows, but the future stretched out before them, bright and boundless. And for the first time, they were ready to face it together. The morning sun rose higher, bathing the city in golden light as life began to stir. The streets outside the hospital bustled with the promise of a new day, and inside, the atmosphere shifted from somber to hopeful. Mia, propped up in her hospital bed, looked stronger than she had just hours before. The boy sat at her side, fingers entwined with hers, a smile breaking through his weariness. Clara entered the room with a steaming cup of coffee for Mr. Henry, who stood by the window, deep in thought. The night had etched new lines on his face, but the light in his eyes was different now, softer, filled with resolve. He turned as Clara handed him the cup, offering her a small, grateful nod. "Thanks, Clara, for everything," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. Clara just smiled, a warmth in her gaze that spoke of silent understanding. Mia watched them, a sense of peace settling over her. The dark memories of Clark's threats and her fight to protect her family had loomed over her for so long, but now, with him behind bars and the truth out, those shadows seemed to retreat. She turned to her father, meeting his eyes with a depth of emotion that needed no words. Henry stepped forward, setting down his cup on the small table by her bed. "I spent too many years letting my pride control me," he admitted, voice raw. "But that's over now. I want to be here for you and for him," he said, glancing at his grandson, whose smile widened. Mia's eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of a release long overdue. "I know, Dad, and I want that too," she whispered, squeezing his hand. The boy, sensing the significance of the moment, wrapped his arms around both of them, giggling as their embrace pulled him in. Clara stood back, the soft glow of morning light catching her hair. She'd witnessed the healing that had taken place, the connections mended and strengthened through shared trials. She felt a pang of pride and joy at seeing the family come together, bound by love stronger than any shadow of the past. "Can we go to the diner later?" the boy asked, his voice small but bright. "I want pancakes." The room burst into laughter, the sound filling every corner with life. Mia brushed the hair from her son's eyes, her smile wide and genuine. "Yes, we'll go to the diner," she said, looking at Clara, who nodded with a grin. The officer returned, clipboard in hand, and a kind smile on her face. "You're all set to leave as soon as you're ready," she announced, pausing as she took in the scene before her. "Take care of each other, all right?" Henry turned to her, eyes serious but softened with gratitude. "We will. That's a promise." The boy jumped from a chair, tugging at his mother's hand. "Let's go home, Mom. Grandpa, come on." His voice was full of energy, free of the weight he'd carried the night before. Mia swung her legs over the side of the bed, Clara steadying her with a gentle touch. As they stepped into the morning light spilling through the hallway, the past seemed to lift away, replaced by the quiet promise of a new chapter. Henry, walking beside them, felt the warmth of his grandson's small hand slip into his own. It was a simple touch, but it held the strength of forgiveness and the start of something that felt very much like home. As they left the hospital, the city waking up around them, it was clear that the journey wasn't just an end. It was the beginning of a new story, one built on second chances, unwavering love, and the power of finding your way back to those who matter most.